What is up, you guys? I hope you're all doing well. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Tony Fuentes. Today we're returning to the Edlike series where we break down the styles of famous creators, photographers, YouTubers or movies and try to replicate the color grading in post-edition with the only purpose of learning how to color grade in the process. Now for this video, we're not going to dive into the profile of a specific character. Instead, we're going to try to replicate Kodak Portra 400 or 800. This video has been highly requested throughout the many years I've been here on YouTube in my Spanish channel, but also over here. And in essence, it's quite an interesting topic because we're trying to replicate the color grading of analog cameras like the ones that we have over here and try to apply the way they render the colors and the exposures into modern digital photography that has high resolutions and high pixelage. So it's going to be quite interesting. So as you know, in film photography, different film stock like this Kodak over here render the exposure, the contrast, the colors in a different manner from the others. So Kodak Portra is quite famous because it's very appealing and very pleasing to look at. So what we're going to do first of all is jump into some examples, check out what we have to do in the color grading department, and then with that knowledge we're going to go into Lightroom, edit a photo, create a preset out of it and see how it performs. So let's jump into it. Now the first example image is this very simple yet beautiful landscape shot by Marco Di Stefano, shot with the Portra 800. Now why I picked this image? Because this is a very natural or direct representation of the Kodak film stock, but in particular the Portra 800. Now Kodak is well known for having a bit desaturated blues tending towards the cyans or the aquas, but also having this very warm cast. So over here we can see how the entire image, even the clouds in the background, have this very yellowish tint or very creamy tint, and that's a characteristic of the Portra. Now pay attention how the greens are tending a bit towards the oranges or towards the yellows. That's something that I'll have to remember. Apart from that, we have the general aspects of film photography when it's shot correctly. We have that high dynamic range. We're not going to see any clipping on the highlights. They're very well preserved and the roll-off is beautiful. And also we have a very nice contrast in this film stock in particular. Notice how the blacks are very pure. They're black, they're not gray or anything like that. And this set of portraits shot by Felix Kaiser, we can notice how the Portra 400 reacts to models in a very natural environment. There's no effects over here, no edited, anything like that. We can notice how the skin is a bit more orangey than usual because it's reacting to the natural warmth of the Kodak film stock. But in general, this is a very natural image with nice contrast. Notice how the blacks are very deep, and then we have that nice roll-off in the skin tones. Now these two previous examples are very natural, but that's not always the case with film photography. Just like digital photography, film photography can be edited and altered in many manners. Anything from the lens that you're using renders the colors in a different manner, maybe the ambient lighting is different, maybe at the time of development you introduce a preset or certain adjustments into your photography to make it a bit more contrasty, or you basically just scan your photos and edit them in post-edition in Lightroom or Photoshop or any program. So film photography, in particular the ones that we see on Instagram, most of the times has been altered. So this one was also shot with a Portra 400 with a bit more exposure. As you can notice, there's some clipping, but pay attention to the colors, how they're a lot desaturated, and the exposure, the contrast is a lot flatter. Now on the other hand, we have this one which is shot as well with a Portra 400, but in this case we have high contrast, much punchier image, much saturation in the skin tones, how he's completely red, and then in the second one we have a very yellow image. So these images have been altered in different segments. Now one style that I really like, that I've seen time and time again on Instagram for the Portra 800 in particular, is this one that we have over here. It's a very beautiful contrasty image with a green tone in the shadows reacting to the warmth added by the Kodak film stock. So it's very nice. You can notice how there's basically some loss of information in dark parts because they're adding some contrast, and then we can see it once again over here in this portrait by Felix Kaiser. Once again, notice how there's a lot more contrast than usual. We have very nice exposure as well in the background. There's no clipping, no overexposure because it's film, but notice how the shadows have this green, light green cast added. Another variant of that green tone, we have it over here in this beautiful portrait of this little doggy. It's a bit less contrasty, but still we have those green tones in the shadows, and we can see it over again in these portraits shot by Marco Di Stefano. Once again, notice how the skin tones are very nice, well preserved, very well exposed image. So this green tint is very appealing. It occurs a lot in the Portra 800, I've read when you're scanning it. But in general aspects, first of all, we want to achieve the basis. First of all, we want the high dynamic range of film photography. Those highlights, we're going to bring them down, and then we're going to bring up the shadows. We have nice dynamic range. Then remember to preserve that nice contrast and those pure blacks, but also we want to add that warmth that the Kodak Portra has, and also greens again towards the yellows, and blues a bit desaturated towards the aqua. So that's what we're going to do. So I think I have all the information that I need. Let's jump into Lightroom and start editing. Okay, creators, once in Lightroom, I have this little collection with photos that we can apply the presets to. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to edit all of them. I'm going to select one, and then we have different scenarios. We have some underexposed images, some overexposed images to see how the preset performs in all those scenarios. Now, we're going to start off with this one, which isn't a very entertaining or exciting photo, but we have the greens that we want to alter. We have a bright sunny day and the blues. So that's why I'm going to choose this one. Now, before I jump into editing, I'm going to remind you that these two presets that we're going to create, the Portra 400 and Portra 800, I'm going to add them to the Edit Preset Pack V2, link up here in case you want to support me. There you can find my personal presets, personal LUTs that you can use to edit your photos as I do every single day. So let's jump into editing. Okay, so first things first, we're going to go into basic corrections and the tone curve to nail down the exposure and retain the most amount of information in the bright parts of our image, like all analog or film cameras. Now, temperature, tint, exposure, and contrast, these four values, I'm going to skip them. I'm going to leave them at 0. These are the values that I'm not going to include in the presets because, as you saw, some of my photos are underexposed, some are overexposed, and these are the 4 values that I'm going to use to adjust the preset to different photos that maybe aren't taken in the best manner on field. So we're going to jump into highlights. Now, remember, we want to preserve the highlights as much as we can, so we want to bring them to the -100. Now, of course not. We're not going to go to a -100. That's way too extreme. We want a very natural looking image. So I'm going to pull down, but not too much. Just below the -60%, -58 is going to be my results. And then shadows, it would be tempting to go to the +100 or the positives to achieve more detail in darker parts of the image. But again, we want a natural image. So I'm going to preserve a bit of the contrast by just putting it down around the -15%. And in that way, we have a very natural and contrasty look. Then we're going to skip whites and blacks for this case. Also, the presence tab completely, we're going to skip it, and we're going to go down to the tone curve over here. Now, the tone curve is a very powerful tool. We can adjust our exposure and contrast, we can correct our image, we can also add some color grading if you want to use the RGB channels. I find them to be a bit imprecise, but if you want an in-depth tutorial about this powerful tool, link up here in case you want to check it out. So what I'm going to do right here is first of all bring down the highlights. I'm going to bring down the highlight roll. Just the whites and the highlights are controlled by this point in general, so I'm going to bring it down, and immediately you can notice the change in the exposure in the bright parts of the image. Then the shadows, I'm going to create a point, I'm going to bring it up above the diagonal, and immediately you can notice how we can brighten the dark parts of our image and bring back a little bit more information. Something around these values. Now, if you're not too sure on where to place the points, you can always just copy the input and the output settings that I've selected over here. And this is basically the coordinates. The x-axis is 35 and the output is the vertical axis or the y-axis, which is 47. And this is just the coordinates of this point. Now we're going to go into the blacks, which is this point down here. Now we have two options. Right here, we can be a bit more conservative and just retain pure blacks as we have right here. The blacks are pure, we don't have any faded out, or we can take the executive decision to pull them up and just fade them up just a bit. As you can see, if I go further up, everything turns to gray and we don't have pure blacks. We can obviously leave it at 0 to be a bit more conservative to the natural look, or in my case, my taste is going to just put it up just a little bit to the output of 11 just to fade them up ever so slightly, just mimicking the look of an image that was shot with maybe a diffusion filter screwed on top, just creating this diffuse in the shadows and also in the highlights. That's my personal preference. You guys can go with 0-0 to achieve pure contrast. Okay, that's enough for basic corrections, exposure and contrast. Next, we're going to move down to color grading. Now for color grading, we're going to start off with camera calibration. This tool that we have over here that can control the red primary, green primary, or the blue primary. In other words, the RGB. In other words, every single pixel that we have on our image is composed by these 3 colors, and by altering them, we're basically altering the color science of our image. Now, if any of you guys are editing in your mobile device, I suggest that you transition into your computer because this tool is not available for the mobile version as of today, and I do not believe that Adobe is going to add it, so bad luck. Now, camera calibration is the most powerful tool because it controls the RGB, but also it controls the color science of your image. So let's say that this image was taken with Canon and I want to match the color grading or the colors or the color science with a Sony or a Nikon camera. This tool can do it. Why? Because every single camera brand has a different value for blue, for red, and for green. Let's say that the greens that Canon has are a little bit more towards the yellows, and the greens that Sony has are a little bit more towards the blues. So right here you can compensate all that and maybe have the skin tones that Canon has or the skin tones that Sony has if you're looking for that. Now, I'm not going to use it to compensate anything. I'm going to use it for creative purposes. So right here, what we want to do is achieve those blues that we wanted and also those yellow greens. So we're going to start off with the blues. The blue primary will affect mostly the blues, but also it will affect every single pixel on our image, but also in particular the yellows, which are direct opposite to the blues. As you can see over here in the color wheel, we have the blues, and directly opposite we have the yellows. A great way to visualize camera calibration is that you're pulling a part of the color wheel and it's affecting the other colors. It's going to affect more the direct opposite rather than the ones at the sides. So I know it's very complex, guys, but if you want an in-depth tutorial about color grading of me trying to explain it, I'll link up here the video to camera calibration. So right here, we want to go towards the negatives. The negatives will change all the blues towards the aquas. Notice how I'll go to -100. Immediately, all the oranges and yellows start to pop up, but also notice how the sky is completely aqua and nothing that we were looking for. It's way too extreme, but that's what you can do. So I'm gonna go a bit towards the negatives, maybe around the -25 is gonna be enough, I think. Just change it ever so slightly to make it a bit more aqua, like we saw in our example images. And then the saturation, I'm just going to pull it down. I'm going to desaturate all of the colors with this, but primarily the blues. So I'm going to pull it down maybe around the -20. I don't want to go too hard. This tool is very dramatic. I suggest that you guys don't move it to the -100 or any crazy values, because it is a very powerful tool that affects your entire image. And now the sky is basically how we wanted it, a bit desaturated and more towards the aquas. Next, the greens. As you can notice over here, our greens, well, they are affected by the blue primary, but they do look a bit too vivid and a bit too blue in my case. So I'm going to pull down the green primary again towards the negatives. Notice how they achieve a bit more saturation. They pop up just a bit more, but they're a bit more yellow. So let's get, again, going to go around the -20 is going to be enough, -23. And immediately you can notice how the greens are a bit more yellow, just what we were looking for. Nothing too extreme, but they're just like we wanted in the Kodak film stock. And then finally, red primary. Now I'm gonna move the red primary with the purpose of affecting the darker greens. Why? Because as you can see, reds are direct opposite to the emeralds. Now the emeralds is a gamma that the green primary is primarily not touching. So what I'm gonna do is move the red primary, and as you can notice, the leaves over here in these palm trees are affected by the red primary because they're more towards the emeralds. They're direct opposite to the reds, so they're affecting. So I'm gonna put it up towards the positives, nothing too crazy, just a bit to add to the orange tones in the greens. And this is what camera calibration has done. The greens are basically more yellow, just like we wanted. The blues are in the point that we wanted. Next, we're gonna move down to color grading. We're gonna skip HSL completely. Again, we don't want to make any drastic or specific changes. So we're gonna go into color grading. Now, color grading is a great tool because it allows us to control any tint or saturation that we can add into the shadows, into the midtones, or into the highlights. Again, just like camera calibration, I recommend you guys to be a bit more conservative with the saturation in particular. Why? Because this tool depends on the exposure and contrast on your image. So let's say right here that I add a blue into the shadows into my image, and it has a 50 saturation. Right here is not affecting a great deal on our image because most of the image is not being classified as shadows. But if I apply the same values, I'm going to copy these settings and I apply them to this image. Let's say that it's a bit darker, more into the shadows. As you can see, I'm going to paste the settings. Notice how the entire image is completely blue. So you have to be very conscious that this tool will affect the image in a different manner depending on the exposure. So I suggest you guys to not exceed the saturation of 15%, even to 18% as a max with this tool. So I'm going to reset the saturation on the shadows. I'm going to go up to the global color wheel, which will just add a color to the entire image. Now, again, if you want an in-depth tutorial about this tool, link up here to the color grading tutorial. So in this case, what we want to do is add that warmth into the entire image like all Kodak film stock has, not only the Portra. So right here, as you can notice, the whites are pure whites and we have the very natural image. So let's add a warm tone. I'm going to pull up the saturation to the maximum just to see with which color I'm going to stay. I'm going to play around, and in this case, maybe more towards the yellows that are tending towards the greens, something around these lines. And the saturation, just going to pull it down. Of course, it's way too high. around 10%. And as you can see, it's barely noticeable at a naked eye. You can notice how they were pure whites in our original image. Now they're a bit more creamy. So this is without, a bit more blue, natural. And now we have that warmth in the entire image. And this is just what we're looking for. Okay, so this first preset that we're creating is a Kodak Portra 400. Then we're gonna add a bit of that green tint into the other one, which is gonna be the 800. So I'm gonna go down now into effects. Now effects, I normally don't like to add them to the preset because, well, they depend also on the type of image. Let's say that we add maybe a 50% grain over here, 50% also in the size, and notice how it's barely noticeable in this large image over here because we have high resolution. Of course, this is shot with my Sony a7 IV, 33 megapixels, and you can notice if you zoom in, this is the size of the grain. But what happens if we crop the image? Unluckily for us, grain is not a tool that adjusts its value depending on the resolution. So right here, as you can see, if I crop the image, the grain is even bigger at the same values. So I highly suggest you guys to maybe not include the grain in your normal presets. In this case, I'm going to include them, but I'm going to be conscious that the size of the grain is going to vary depending on the resolution of my image. Okay, now that we know that disclaimer, so I'm going to go with around 33 in the amount, 46 in the size, and then the roughness, just going to pull it up maybe around the 55 just to add a bit more contrast to it. So if we zoom out, we have this very organic and natural texture. If we zoom in, we can see that film grain. Now, why am I adding film grain? Because, well, Kodak Portra 400, Kodak Portra 800, well, those numbers are the values of the ISO or the ISO. Back in the day, film cameras, they don't have a little wheel that you can basically make your image brighter or darker with the ISO. That didn't exist. In that case, you had to use maybe another film stock with higher ISO to shoot in lower light conditions. So that's why 400 is more used in the day and 800 is more used at darker times. Okay, so this preset is basically finished. Here we have the before and after. Let's test it in other images, and first of all we have to save it. We're going to go to the left panel over here. On the presets, hit the plus sign, create preset, and after you name it, remember that white balance, exposure, contrast, they need to be unmarked because these are the values that we're going to use to adapt the preset to other photos. Then detail, lens corrections, and transform, also we don't want to use them. And right here, effects, remember to mark it, and also calibration. Okay, so here I have this image of my friend Patricio, taking ages to take this photo. Instead, I took a photo of him and the background, but notice how there's a lot of overexposure because there was a lot of mist coming in this afternoon. So let's apply first of all the preset, and immediately you can notice the difference. Here we have an image which is more controls, more laid back in the exposure. We can see a lot more detail in the shiny parts of our image. And also we can basically see new buildings that didn't appear in the original one. In this case, we did a good job by retaining a bit of the highlights, bringing them back. And also we have this very warm look into the entire image. Next, we have this image that already looks quite like film. So let's apply the preset and it just adds to the effect. It looks fantastic. Notice how the greens, they're basically a lot more yellow. They're basically what we were looking for. The blues in the sky are a lot more aqua and nailed back, and also the overall exposure of the sky is brought down just a bit. So I think we did quite a good job. This image looks fantastic. How about over here? We have this image, and in particular pay attention to the overexposed parts in the skin and also in the hair. So this preset is going to be perfect for portrait. So let's see how it performs over here. So right here we have the results, and immediately you can notice how the exposure is a lot more controlled. The highlight roll off is beautiful on the skin now, and also the skin tones are a bit more orangey because of the change that we added in camera calibration, but also in color grading. And we have a lot more information in the bright parts of the image. It's looking just fantastic, this preset for portraits. Finally, let's see it in this one of this girl in the metro, once again, or the subway as you like to call it. Let's apply the preset over here, and it's looking quite nice actually. Maybe in this case I would amp up the exposure just a bit. But there we have it. Notice the difference in the blues in particular, how they're a bit more retro. We have that warm tone or creamy tone in the whites. So let's move on to the Portra 800. Now, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but the Portra 800, the green tone that we saw in the example images, is a byproduct of the scanning process of the film. So sometimes it's not a wanted color or a wanted tint, but other cases, a lot of people like that green tint that appears. after they scan their images. So that's why most of the images that we see of Portra 800 have that green tint. Now, in this case, we can try to replicate that green tint because I really liked it. So right here, we have this image of my friend Patricia. I'm going to use the Portra 400 as a base to start our color grading or our little variant. So right here, it looks fantastic. Maybe a bit too dark, so I'm going to pull up the exposure just a bit. But immediately you can notice how we have already those preserved highlights and have that very nice warm tone. So now we have to do some minor changes just to make this preset a little variant on it to create the Portra 800. Now this first step is completely optional, guys. I'm going to bring back a bit of the shadows to make it a bit more punchy and contrasty. So I'm going to pull down the shadows towards the negatives, maybe around the -40, and immediately you can notice how it's a lot more dark, moody and punchy. And also I'm going to bring back a bit of the blacks in the tone curve just to make them pure blacks over here, something around these lines. No, maybe I'm going to return it. A bit of indecision right here, yeah, just going to leave it like that. But then to create this variant, I'm going to go down to the color grading, and here, instead of adding a color to the global color wheel, we're going to leave it with that warm tone. We're going to move down to the shadows. Here we can add that green tone. So again, add some saturation and play around until you find the tone that you really like. I'm going to go maybe with this 101 in the hue, and of course the saturation is way too high, maybe around an 11%. And there we have this preset. So here we have it, our green Portra 800 preset. So there's the before and after, and it looks fantastic. Let's save this preset and see how it performs in other images. So here we have the captain of the Vaporetto in Venice, Italy. Of course, this is tilted. I would have to crop it and correct the angle, but let's see how the presets perform. So here we have the Portra 400, and it just looks fantastic, this preset over here. I really like how it looks. This warm tone, very soft, highlights, very nice. And now let's see the 800, and I love this one even more. It just looks so retro, it's fantastic, this green tone. How about in the image of my friend Patricia taking the photo? This is the 400, and now let's see the 800. Wow, it looks, I'm sorry, I'm gonna put this in full screen. Fantastic preset over here. Of course, it's a bit too underexposed, so I would compensate a bit with the exposure around these lines, but it looks fantastic in my view. Now, this is the Portra 400, the original at the left, and the 800, and that just adds this green tone. It looks so film, I don't know, it just looks fantastic. I really like it. And finally, let's see this image that has a bit overexposure. Let's bring back a bit of the highlights with the exposure. And now let's see the 400 first of all. Oh, it looks fantastic, this preset over here with the warm tones. And now let's see the 800. Just adds this green vibe into the entire image. Of course, you could play around with the contrast and exposure to bring it down even more, but just looks beautiful. Before we go, let's see how these two presets look in a landscape photo. This is very important. So let's see the 400, and now we can see how the sky is a bit more desaturated, a bit more aqua, but it's there. It has the colors. Also, we can see most of the colors are well represented, and then the greens are a bit more yellow. Nothing too extravagant, but they do look a bit more film-like. And the 800, well, it adds a bit more green, nothing too special. So there you have it, guys, my interpretation on the Portra 800 and Portra 400 from Kodak. I really liked how these two presets turned out. I'm going to use them in some Instagram photos. I know some people, some haters are going to appear in the comment section, some purists that aren't even subscribed to the channel, but who cares? So remember that these two presets, I added them to the Edit Preset Pack V2 and Edit LUT Pack V2. So in case you want to apply these settings into your video as well, link up here. So guys, if you want to watch a marathon of the Edit series, watch the playlist right here. Or if you want to watch just another random video from me, click up here. I'm Tony Fuentes. Cheers to all of you, and I'll see you in the next one.